Hi, I'm Tim, and welcome to Watch You Want. Thanks for logging on. It seems as many James Bonds as there are that many James Bond Submariners. And while all Rolex Submariners are special and can rightfully be called the watches of the true James Bonds, the Roger Moores, the Sean Connerys, not so much the Timothy Daltons and the George Lazenbys. But the Rolex Submariner is an icon, and it is inextricably linked to the world's favorite secret agent. Now, that doesn't mean that this Rolex 5508 Submariner needs to bask in reflected glory, because it is a star in its own right. As one of the original small crown Submariners, you can see it's quite distinct from today's modern broad-shouldered crown guard, glossy dial, non-chapter ring Submariners. And we're going to break down everything that makes it different, talk a little bit about the Bond connection. But what's really significant about this watch is, even though it represents the formative years of the Sub when it was sort of coalescing into the feature suite that we know today as the Submariner, it's nevertheless instantly recognizable as a Rolex Sub and as a Rolex. So the DNA was essentially there from the beginning, and in this reference 5508 Oyster Perpetual Submariner, Rolex had the makings of a legend. But this 5508 is a legend in its own right. On the wrist, you can see why this watch was chosen for Bond. Robust, sober, upscale, but no nonsense. The idea of the mechanical watch as a tool watch might seem a little bit laughable today, considering most of them are found grazing at boardrooms across America. But the reality is that during the 1950s, you had different price points for different grades of tool watch, and while there were simple snap-on back watches that boasted some degree of water resistance, companies like Rolex, Omega, Breitling, and Blancpain were launching what was then sort of a mid-market, high-grade, no-nonsense professional type of dive watch, starting with the Blancpain 50 Fathoms in 1953 and the Rolex Submariner in 1954. We started to see the emergence of watches that were designed specifically with the burgeoning professional and amateur dive sectors in mind. Now, on the wrist, you can see the 5508 is the classic profile of a 1950s Sub. It has what's known as the gilt dial, so a gold tone to the graphics of the chapter ring. That's the ring with the indexes painted on that runs around inside the rehaut of the dial. It has the gold Rolex graphic marquee and Oyster Perpetual text at 12 o'clock, and then Submariner is written just below silver text, Submariner in this case in gold, at 6 o'clock. My apologies in advance for the hand overlap. But the bottom line is that this watch is obviously a patinaed piece, but the gilt is easily legible, everything's distinct. This watch is what you would call just enough patina. Patina is the idea that a watch over time will show signs of age, but at the same time, those signs of age sort of tell the story of the timepiece, where it's been, the age contained within its pressure vessel, the story it has to tell. Basically, it's a sign of the mileage, the water under the bridge, and it's a beautiful thing for a historical piece like this, which is vintage and yet not compromised by any actual damage. That's the key to patina. It has to show age without compromising legibility, functionality, or key elements of integrity like the structure of the dial, the visibility or form of the indexes, the actual printing of the chapter ring, the Rolex crown, the Rolex graphics, the lettering on the dial. All of that is beautifully distinct and beautifully intact on this 5508. Now, my wrist is 6 1/3 inches, that's 16 centimeters in circumference, so this is really a perfect size watch for me. And I'm going to mention that because vintage watches tend to be a little bit smaller, the opportunity to get one that's 38 millimeters from the dive watch class from the 1950s, early 1960s, really allows you to have something that is universally respected, distinctly vintage in appearance, and yet not dwarfed by contemporary styles. It's still a good size to wear on the wrist, and because Rolex uses fairly broad shoulders in their lugs and integrated end links in their bracelets, then and now, the watches wear just a little bit bigger than their nominal size. If you look at it just in profile, the silhouette of it from overhead almost looks like a cushion case. So it's got a large, distinct, and robust form to it. A lot of shoulder. This is a pretty barrel-chested watch for a 38. Also notable is that because it is an older watch, everything's just a little bit more pared down, a little bit more elegant in proportion. Now, the watch does have automatic winding, and it is 100-meter water resistant as designed. I wouldn't test the upper limits of that rating today, These watches are generally worn for their historical value rather than hardcore sports watch endeavors. But the bottom line is, back in the day, as robust as it was, it's nevertheless quite appropriate in a dress format as a dress watch, a formal companion today. You can see how flat it sits against the wrist, really hunkered down there. Now the watch has a beautiful acrylic or plexiglass crystal that you can see pokes up just above the bezel, but there's a tremendous amount of tumble home from the top of the crystal to the bezel down the flank of the case. This easily slips under even the tightest of dress cuffs, and nothing is more becoming of elegant couture than this Rolex Oyster Perpetual Submariner 5508. James Bond pulled it off in a tuxedo, and believe me, so can you. Heck, in this thing, even I'd look like a secret agent. This is a fantastic reference that has a great history behind it, as during the 1950s, Rolex rolled out upwards of a dozen Submariner references as they searched for the secret sauce, the formula that was eventually to more or less coalesce around the 1680 during the mid-1960s, but you can see little steps that were taken along the way. In the 5508, you'll notice that the crown guards that are iconic of the model today aren't present. The crown is also quite a bit smaller. There were two types of crowns during the 1950s fundamentally. There were the small crowns, which are nicely proportioned 6mm units like you see here, and there were the big crowns, which were 8mm. Those were easier to use with a glove or when your hand was sweaty or wet, but they do look a little bit cartoonish in proportion to the cases, especially absent any kind of crown guard to flesh it out and taper it into the form of the case itself. Now you'll also notice that in the absence of the crown guard, there's also this chapter ring, a feature within the bezel no longer included on Rolex Submariner models. This is considered a bit of an anachronism, but it's beautiful and highly sought by Rolex collectors, especially when it's in outstanding condition. The platonic ideal for a vintage Rolex really is to have a little bit of patina, but not to the point that it compromises any of the actual features of the dial. That is, don't have anything that's flaking off, chipped off, or scratched off. This watch doesn't. It's a perfect patina in many respects, and with that golden gilt color, you have something else that's uncommon on later Rolexes. It has real color, real charm, almost an auburn hue to the whole. Gorgeous in person. I encourage you to check out the high-resolution images on our website Watch You Want to get a better sense of this watch. Now, inside the case beats Rolex's in-house 1530 caliber. Why do I bother to say in-house in reference to a Rolex movement? Aren't they all? Well, today they are. But when the Submariner launched in 1954, the movements were not in fact in-house, and it was only in the course of developing the 1000 series and then the 1500 series later in the 1950s that Rolex began to take the Submariner movements in-house. So that's another important respect in which this 5508 represents a transitional step in the evolution of the Rolex signature dive watch. Now the movement is a nice slow and steady 18,000 beat automatic winder. It's gorgeous to actually open up and look at, and if you look at the watchmaker caseback images we have on our website, you'll see that the characteristic of the early Rolex in-house Oyster Perpetual Submariner movements are all present and correct. There are the brass, not purple, not Teflon coated reversing wheels on the movement, just as Rolex built them in the late 50s. There is the famed butterfly winding rotor, which really has to be seen rather than described. What else can I say other than it sort of resembles a butterfly? But the 1530 caliber was an important mechanical refinement and a technological step forward for Rolex, both in terms of the manufacturer content within the Submariner line and in terms of Rolex's progression from a établisseur of a very high caliber to a full-fledged manufacturer extraordinaire as they are today. This Rolex 5508, as we've realized, needs no help from James Bond to appeal to the connoisseur. It's beautiful, it's beautifully preserved, it's historically significant, it's all of a piece. The fact that you can just envision a watch like this on the wrist of Sean Connery on the beach as Ursula Andress walks out of the surf definitely adds a romantic angle. But the bottom line is this 5508 Rolex Submariner doesn't need any help. See it in high-resolution images on our website, Watch You Want.